Hello everybody, welcome back to another video. Today we're going to take a little bit more of an in-depth look into the track that I made for my last video. If you haven't seen my last video yet, the concept was that I gave 3 producer friends a beat and we all 4 made a track on top of that beat. Everybody gave a little bit of a breakdown of what they did in their track, and also we listened to each other's finished song. So that means that I'm not going to play the track in this video just to keep things a little bit constrained in terms of length. If you want to listen to the whole track that I'm showing off in this video, then make sure to watch the last video so that you're up to speed on what I'm actually explaining. So without further ado, let's jump right into it. Hey guys, I quickly wanted to say that my second masterclass is out now on my Gumroad. It's about 24 hours of edited footage of me making the track that you're listening to right now. So go check it out if you're interested. So as you can see, this is a big project, so I do have to keep it a little bit small in terms of the explanations of all of the different sound design things that I'm doing. Also, I've been working on this track for roughly 6 months, so there are a few things that might not be exactly clear to me. So during the recording, I'm going to look into things and try to understand what I'm actually doing and why I'm actually doing it. But there are some things that I might not be able to explain the exact reasoning behind why I thought of doing it that way instead of another way. So in those cases, I will just explain what is actually going on. So I'm just going to go sound by sound, and this is going to be the first sound here, with a nice aggressive impact that kind of defines the start of the drop. As you can see where it is in relation to the beat, it's just after the kick hits as well as at the halfway point. So it plays a few times at the start of the kind of kick and bass section as well as at the halfway points. So it adds a little bit of extra impact to those particular sections. Now really what this sound comes down to is a bunch of different saw waves, kind of detuned, different octaves. As you can see, we also have it going through a little bit of a bandpass, which adds a little bit of extra movement, a little bit of extra tone to it. This then goes through a distortion as well as a compressor, but all of this is just to kind of create the tone that is actually going into the next plugin. So next plugin that I'm using that I haven't really shown off on my channel a lot because I don't really use it that often is Trash 2. It is a very nice distortion unit and it also allows you to do a bunch of other things. There's some filters in here, as you can see. There's a convolution that I'm using. I believe this particular setup is based off a preset that I found and I just kind of modified it to taste. I may have changed some parameters like the gain and the mix and the overall mix of the whole effect here. So this is the mix for the distortion part here. Here you can see the distortion curve that I'm actually using. And I'm just using only stage 1, stage 2 is turned off. And then it goes through a little bit of an EQ. I think this is just included into the preset as well. And then it goes through the convolution here, which gives it the kind of amplifier kind of sound that we hear. It almost sounds like a little bit of a guitar kind of sound. And you can really hear the magic that this brings to the sound. If we turn it off, it feels a little bit boring. It's still a nice impact sound, but it doesn't really have that unique kind of texture of the guitar kind of amplifier to it. And with the Trash 2, it sounds like this. So it has much more of a guitar vibe, which was kind of the sound that I was going for. I don't think that I specifically decided to go for a guitar sound, but once I started browsing presets and I ended up on something that I kind of liked here, I kind of just stuck with it. And then from that point, I decided to actually continue with it and try to maybe get a few of those kind of qualities out of the sound even more. What I wanted to do more was make it a little bit more plucky. So that's what this kind of EQ is doing here. Otherwise it sounds like this, which was a little bit too aggressive for what I was looking for. I really wanted this to be kind of the impact of the drop. Next up we have an overdrive, which just adds a little bit of extra kind of loudness, a little bit of extra width as well. You can see the spread knob is also being used. Then finally we have a delay and a reverb. So moving on to the next sound, I wanted to make something very staccato. So as you can see from the initial patch, I just took away from the tones pack, duplicated it, put it up an octave and set the detune to 3. These both go again through a bandpass filter. I'm actually automating the filter cutoff here. So that's one of the key kind of parameters that adds movement to the sound, as it often does. I added a little bit of a release so that I could have very short notes. As you can see from the MIDI down below, the notes are very short, but then the release obviously adds a lot more to the sound, and therefore you get a little bit of a bigger sound than the note may suggest. But still, this kind of creates a pluckiness that I really like in the sound, and it makes it a little bit more dynamic. In terms of effects, we have a distortion again here. This distortion is tied to the release, otherwise when you turn the release, when the volume goes down because of the release and you have a very strong distortion, it will kind of destroy the original dynamics of the sound. And this way, if you tie it like this to the envelope, it just keeps the dynamics of the original sounds and kind of layers the distortion on top. Next up, we have a dimension expander. As you can see, this is set up with a nice big size as well as 50% mix. I can see that during the sound design process, I at some point decided to also have the hyper in there. You can see that the re-trigger is on, so I was definitely messing around with the hyper, but I decided to turn that off again. Finally, we have another low pass filter. This is a low pass 6, just to add a little bit of extra movement. A low pass 6 is a very shallow filter, so it just gets rid of a little bit of the higher frequencies, not so much as a 12 dB or 18 dB or 24 dB even. From there, as you can see, I'm using automations to add in the central movement for the synth first, and then some other automations which regard this EQ here, which just does a little bit of extra gain for this sound here, because I'm actually turning down the frequency here. So here it's just coming in kind of slowly, and here it's just full on, full sound, and we just only hear the movement from this sound. The next sound that I have is this one here. And this is a very, very simple sound. What you'll see, what I do a lot is I just generate a tone with the oscillators, and then I use some kind of filtering to add in the movement. And that's kind of the standard way of creating those flowing psytrance sounds that have this very nice gritty sound to them. Sometimes I'll use one of my tone packs, sometimes I'll use a certain kind of wavetable, sometimes I'll use a setup like this where I'm just using an FM setup of two sounds being FM'd in some way. You can see here we have the saw wave being FM'd by this analog sine here, and those both go through the filter. Finally, there's a little bit of a distortion trick. Again, it's a similar trick to before where we have the envelope tied to the distortion. In this case, I'm using the drive. That gives a little bit of a different vibe than doing it to the mix directly. And it's not so much exactly preserving the dynamics. But you can see that this is a very easy kind of filler sound that just sits into the beat here and adds a little bit of extra movement to this part of the beat. To be honest, with so many different sounds going on, it's really hard to make each sound stand out. And therefore, I don't try to do that. Sometimes I just want a little bit of a different like filler sound that fills up the space instead of being kind of like this main sound that takes your attention and really tries to, you know, sound very, very cool. Because it's all relative. You cannot have 50 different sounds in a track, or however many there are. There's not 50, but there's at least like 15 different sounds in this part of the track alone here that are all fighting for the same space, and you cannot have every sound be an impactful, cool sound, because then none of them are. So you need a few sounds that are just like a little bit easier for the listener, a little bit simpler of a sound, just a tone with a filter on top of it, doing some kind of movement to keep the track going. Another good example is this sound here. This sits right after our main impact here, the main guitar impact from before. So together they sound like this. They just add a little bit of an extra layer to the guitar impact. It just kind of comes after it, makes it a little bit more interesting, but it doesn't take away from the actual guitar impact itself. So this sound is actually based off a technique that I've shown off a lot on my channel, and that is to take a saw wave and to go in here and click randomize all. Each time that you do it, you'll get a random kind of cycle here, as you can see. And it doesn't really matter what the wave looks like, because they're all going to sound the same. They're all going to have kind of saw wave qualities, but with, instead of having like one click, it sounds a little bit more noisy and a little bit like the high end is distributed over the whole waveform, instead of just this single click where normally all of the high end sits. So you go here, randomize all, and then you'll get some kind of waveform that has that kind of property. So you can see again, two oscillators, one an octave up with more unison and more detune. They both go through a filter, and this filter is adding again the movement here, together with having movement from this level going up and down. And in terms of the effects, it's going to become very, very boring, but it's going to be the same thing. We have a hyper dimension for a little bit of width. In this case, we're using both the hyper as well as the dimension. Something interesting here is that the hyper is completely wet, which is not something that I often like to do, but for this sound it just really worked. We have another asymmetrical distortion. The mix again is modulated to add a little bit of extra dynamics and to kind of remove the kind of fattening and the flatness that you normally get from the distortion. We then have a compressor to bring out all of the frequencies, and then finally to tame it a little bit more and add a little bit of the movement back in again, we have another very shallow 6 dB filter. When it comes to the processing chain, there's not really a lot to kind of look at. This is a very basic processing chain. We have an OTT, which is at 25% wet. We have an EQ to take out the lower frequencies and the higher frequencies. We have some stereo processing here. This stereo processing just makes sure that kind of the width is very controlled. It also adds a little bit of excitement to the high end and to the sound in general. We have a saturator, which is going to make it loud and make it kind of clip towards 0. As you can see, the soft clipper is on, so that's going to make sure that it doesn't peak above 0 in the chain. Finally, we have a nice big convolution reverb on this sound and a sidechain. So the next sound that is in here is this ARP that comes in towards the end, but I've also used it as a one shot earlier on. In here, I think it just kind of remained from the kind of idea that I had with it. You can hear that it's very, very quiet and it's not really adding anything. Whereas in other portions where I use it as a one shot, it is much louder and much clearer. So I would almost say that we can disregard these 3 one shots here. What we can look at is the ARP itself. So I'm going to play it from, say, here. This is kind of where it comes in. And this is really its moments to kind of shine and add its energy to the actual track. This is where it becomes one of the main elements. And then it starts to fade out again. So we have a fairly basic pluck patch in here. You can see there's 2 wavetables being used. The main sound is coming from the second wavetable, which is actually completely controlled by this oscillator here. Finally, the first oscillator's level is controlled by the velocity, as you can see, so I can use velocity to accentuate different parts of the sound. And as you can see, I haven't really used it, only in the case of these kind of ghost notes where I wanted to use it and I wanted to lower it a little bit. So there we get a little bit of a different tonality to the sound, and obviously also a little bit of a drawback in volume because one of the oscillators is going down in volume there. But you can see that this second oscillator isn't actually controlled by velocity, so that doesn't react to this velocity change that we have set up for the first oscillator. So for our pluckiness, it goes through a filter which is controlled by the amp envelope, as you can see here, as well as the macro. We then have a chorus which is just set up to add a little bit of extra width and just make the sound a little bit bigger than it is without it. So without it sounds like this. I think the best way to describe it is that it takes a sound which is fairly clearly defined in the sense of that it sounds like a fairly normal pluck, and it just kind of smears it out just a little bit in a way that makes it sound a little bit lusher, a little bit less well defined, and that kind of works well for these kind of ARPs where you want the ARP to not be very aggressive and very in your face. So I wouldn't use this, for example, on an acid line, but something like an ARP plug like this can really benefit from a little bit of chorus like this, just added on top to draw out the wave and to make it less defined, because obviously what it does is it takes your input signal and it just delays it a couple of times and it creates a bunch of copies which are all playing at different kind of time. In this case you can see the delays are very, very short. We're talking a couple of milliseconds here, but still it adds a little bit of extra kind of quality to the sound. Next up we have the downsampling distortion here, which has its mix controlled by the envelope itself, so it follows the dynamics of the actual sound. And then its drive is controlled by the macro, so that we get a little bit of movement in the actual peaks that this downsampling generates. We have an EQ for some filtering. We have an LFO tool here, which just adds a little bit of extra movement to it. You can see we have delay here, which I'm automating heavily. The main automations that are happening here is to switch between different kind of delay settings for the different uses that I had for the sound as a one shot, as opposed to just the ARP itself. Obviously for a one shot where you have a lot more space after the actual sound happens, you have a little bit more time to have the delay ring out and have a little bit more of an interesting delay. Next up is a very cool trick where we have this reverb chain. This is my standard kind of reverb chain if I want to use H reverb stereo. The reason why I have it open up in an audio effect rack is because if I go to my menu and I go to the reverbs, there's two different ones of them, so I need to be able to select between the two, and therefore I just created this kind of wrapper around it, which I can name, and then I can specifically search for this type of the reverb. But in this case, I open it up and I decided to do something with the resonators. What this allows you to do is make the reverb a little bit more tonal. So you can see we're resonating at a bunch of different pitches, and the settings don't really matter. This is something that you can experiment with yourself. But the resonator is basically going to give resonances to all of the frequencies that kind of fall within the key. So it makes the reverb sound a little bit more in key. And this is done before the reverb, so we have a little bit of an EQ afterwards, which we can play with. Again, we're automating a bunch of different parameters, and then we go into the actual reverb itself. As you can see also for the one-shot mode, the actual dry signal is turned off. This is the dry effect here, and this is the wet effect, and I'm also automating how much wetness I want from 0 to 6 here over the length of the ARP. The final thing on this sound is that there's an auto pan, which just adds a little bit of panning movement. And what I want to show you for this sound in particular is the amount of automations that I use to kind of create the movement in the sound. You can see there's a whole bunch of different automations which over the course of the 6 months that I've been producing just kind of add more and more movement to the sound, which to me is really what Psytrance is all about. It's creating a bunch of different textures and atmospheres and sounds and whatever you want to call it that move from one section to the other. And with having many automations and having different kind of movements in the sound, very short movements like what we're doing with the delay in this movement here, you can see it's just going up and down in terms of input gain for the delay. We have longer movements as well as, for example, one of these parameters, which is the main macro that I'm using. We have a filter coming in here. We have this parameter also moving up. We have the auto pan amount going down and then going back up again to, again, put everything in the center at the point where it's the most intense. And then once we're getting into the point where I want this to have a little bit less energy, it's starting to move from side to side again. And then finally, the main big movements is the difference between, for example, say this one shot here where we have something turned off and this part here or these parts here where they're turned on. So hopefully you can see that I'm using a lot of different automations and a lot of different effects to just add movements to like long sounds like this, especially when I'm using a sound both as, in this case, an ARP as well as a one shot. The next sound is this one here. You can see it's the same basic idea that I've been talking about. We set up a tone somehow and then we use a filter to add the movement, and we have some basic effects in this case to just make it loud, give it a nice strong quality, and then the effects are used to just beef up the sound, make it loud, make it stand out a little bit. And then we have a bunch of different automations to actually create the movement in the sound itself. Overall, again, the chain is very standard. An OTT, stereo control, an EQ, a saturator for the loudness. We have a reverb and then a delay, and then finally a sidechain. So overall, a very kind of standard processing chain for Psytrance synth. What is interesting about this sound is that this is one of the few sounds where I use kind of pitch impacts. So this is a very short envelope. If I zoom in, you can see it's just a couple of milliseconds long, and it just targets the pitch of both of the oscillators here. That gives it that impact that you can hear in this particular sound. It gives that very strong kind of click at the start of the sound. And you can see that I'm turning down the macro because I want this click to happen in the first two, but not in the last one. So this one does not have a click, these first two do have a click. The next sound is a fill sound. This is the sound that sits right in the kick fill part of my track, right before one of the main vocals comes in. So this just acts like kind of like a small riser. So this patch is a little bit more complex, there's a little bit more going on, but the principle stays the same. We try to create a nice tone with the oscillators, and then all of the movement is going to come from filters and effects and stuff like that. What we do have in terms of movement is that we have it tied to an LFO, specifically this LFO2 here is controlling the volume of both of the oscillators. This one is it controlled directly. The other one we have a macro, and this is tied as an auxiliary source to the actual macro. So both of the volumes are actually controlled by this LFO here. One is directly controlled and the other one is indirectly controlled. Finally, this LFO also controls the drive of our final filter here. But there's another LFO at half the timing which controls the actual main filter of the sound, as well as the mix of the distortion that we're using. Again, this is to imprint some kind of dynamics onto the sound, and you can hear that we have a 1/4 note kind of movement to it. But you can also hear the 1/8 note. Of course, with all of the effects that happen later, like this compressor here, we have another extra filter in here. We have a whole bunch of different things that we're automating. You can see the amount of automation lines that sit in here just to make the sound work. But you also have another OTT that sits in here. We have another saturator to really beef up the sound and to imprint some more dynamics onto it. You can see that this output is also going up over time, so that adds loudness to it because we're clipping into this output. So this is an actual kind of control of the peak level of the sound, and therefore also of the RMS level, so the actual perceived loudness of the sound is also increasing with this automation. But when it comes to the kind of sound design that we're doing here, you need to remember that this was done over like 6 months. So I may have started off with a very simple version of this sound and I decided, oh, it needs some more movement, it needs some more this, it needs some more that. I do believe this MIDI clip at some point was longer. You can see it having a longer length of the note here, but I decided to cut it up as well. So it goes through many changes and it goes through many versions, and all of those kind of add to the complexity of what the sound is trying to do. But you can see that the system with which I make the sound is very much still the same. Generate a tone, add the movement that you want it to do, and then process it to fit in the track with whatever you want. The loudness first of all, the tone that you want to control, and then finally, in this case, just the delay. And with all of that, you can hear how it actually sits in the track.
Knowing, and there's an ending state. Then you get beyond that.
So this sound sits a little bit later into the track. This is what it sounds like. A nice aggressive plucky sound. As you can see from the patch, it's heavily based on this second wavetable here. They're obviously both mixing together, but this is really what adds the grit to it. Without it, it just sounds like this. You can see this is based on the wave folder kind of technique here, so that adds the kind of clickiness that you want from this kind of sound, as well as the bending mode here. Those two together create the texture that we want. That then again goes through a bunch of different effects. I'm not going to go over these effects anymore because I just want to speed up the video, and I think you guys get the point of the effects at this point, what I'm actually trying to do with the different effects, and you can see how I'm actually using them. Same with these things like the OTT, the EQ, and the stereo control. I don't have to explain over and over again that I'm using stereo processing to determine the stereo width of different frequencies. I think at some point that just becomes clear. Here we have a different impact sound. This is kind of the same idea as the first sound, but I actually made it earlier, and I didn't like how it sounded in the main portion of the track where all of the different synths are playing together. So I just kind of used it at this point of the track, at the start of the track. It layers nicely on top of one of my main atmospheres here. So you can see we're again generating a tone with the oscillators, adding a movement with the LFO here and the filter, and then we have a bunch of different effects that it goes through, as well as some of the processing. So this next sound that we have is these high bell sounds. This is fairly interesting because a lot of the sound actually happens in the MIDI. If you look at the MIDI pattern, as you can see, it's a very fast arp that's just playing down. And all of these notes are just in key. I believe these are just a bunch of notes from the actual key G sharp that I have here. And you can see that they're just repeating, which essentially means that we're creating the different harmonics that the sound has with the different notes that we play, because we play them so close together. When it comes to the sound itself, it's very simple. We just have a bunch of sine waves with a little bit of movement coming in from the envelope here, which just makes it so that it moves a little bit through the wavetable that it uses. Finally, we have a filtered distortion on top of that. In parallel, as you can see, we have a hyperdimension, again, a reverb and an EQ. Then obviously you have our standard processing of delay and equalizing. And this equalization is actually what is responsible for the main movement of it coming from a high kind of feeling to a much lower feeling. It's just filtering out the lower end at the start. That goes paired with an increase in actual volume. The next sound sounds like this. Again, very, very simple. We generate a tone, we use a distortion in this case. In this case, the filter is after the actual distortion, so the distortion gets filtered out. That means that I can get away with a much stronger distortion than if they were the other way around. This then goes through my standard range of effects. And in this case I actually have two sidechains because I wanted the sidechain on this part to be stronger than on the same kind of note here. Even though this is on a kick, I wanted to have this sound impact a little bit more than the actual kind of ghost notes that sit in front of it. So we have our standard kind of compressor sidechain to achieve the main sidechain that I wanted, and then LFO tool is responsible for the extra sidechain that just sits on this part here. You can see the LFO depth actually coming down for this part here. Otherwise it would be way too extreme. Next sound is this one here. And again, we generate a tone, this case again with just a bunch of different saw waves at different unison amounts, different detunes. We have our filter for movement. We have some distortion, some hyper and a high pass. It goes through OTT, EQ, saturation, delay and then a sidechain, and that results in this sound. Next sound is this one here. This is a little bit more interesting because I'm using this cool setup in phaseband here. If you know my channel, you know what I mean with the SSQ carrier. I've shown this off many times on my channel before, but this is an FM setup that mimics the kind of clicky FM that you get from a Viers TI. In this case, the sound's main filter movement is coming from this slice EQ. You can see the setup here. I'm using a bunch of different bands and then I'm actually using the offset to modulate between those bands, and you can see what kind of filter movement we're getting from that. So it's a little bit more of a complex filter than just a band pass or a high pass or a low pass. And they're all still tied together. They move all together in equal amounts. So we go through an OTT, an enhance and a warm fuzz preset. Sometimes I just like to drop on presets from different kind of distortion tools to just get a little bit more distortion out of it. We have stereo width, we have an EQ here, then a saturator. And then we're doing something cool with the delay itself. You can see that towards the end here, where we are in the fill, I actually up massively the actual output of the delay. So you can hear that it has this kind of double feeling of the sound coming in, rising up until here, then kind of downing up until this point, and then going back in here, and then delaying out over here. What that means is that the sound in the fill is just going to be a little bit more interesting because we have this delay texture layered in with all of the other elements that sit in this fill. If there are any, mainly just atmospheres, as you can see. Here we have another sound where we have basically a very similar setup. You can see we use two tones, one is an octave lower than the other. The interesting thing here is that this lowest octave is actually not going through the filter, only the highest one is. I don't exactly know why I did this way, but it seems to work for the sound. We then have a distortion, compressor, hyperdimension, and then a filter. Now this sound itself actually does not have any automations, so it's just in there to add a little bit of extra detail. To enhance the sound though, what I did is I used a delay with a fairly long delay time, but no feedback. And you can hear what that does. It just repeats once on every side because it's a ping pong delay, but it does not kind of continue to ring out, and therefore it keeps it a little bit cleaner. That you can also see that the filter is turned off, so we get the whole range of frequencies actually delaying. With most normal delays, what I like to do is to remove the high end of the kind of delay part of the sound so that it doesn't kind of take away from all the main sounds that might sit in the track. Next sound is this one. This is a vital patch, as you can see, and this is just using a wavetable. I believe this might be from Dash Glitch. Yes, so this is from the pack from Dash Glitch, Psytrance Essentials Volume 3. In this case, I decided to go with a windowing technique. So what we're doing here is we're using this LFO, which is key tracked, as you can see, and we're using that to modulate the level. And then we're changing the phase randomly. So it will select a portion of the wave and just play that portion. You can see in the little oscilloscope up here that it's kind of taking small portions of the actual sound. Finally, we have two voices with a little bit of detune. We have a chorus in here, and it just goes through an EQ which tames the high end and a delay. The next sound that I have is a contact library. As you can see, if I open up contact here, we have this ragtime piano here. This is the same principle as that ARP that I showed off before, where we play a bunch of different notes and we use that to kind of create the texture. You can hear that it's mainly delay and reverb that is actually part of the sound, and it just kind of comes in as a nice sound that kind of layers on top of the track. The next sound that I have are these big chords that I like to use sometimes. This is just a supersaw patch. As you can see, we have 3 stacks of supersaws at different octaves. That then goes through a filter. We have this envelope here which is controlling the drive for the distortion. And then again, it's a bunch of different effects which just tie the sound together. And then a bunch of different processing effects also again to tie the sound together. Now the next sound is a sound that I've used in a different track actually. There's actually a bunch of different sounds that come from different tracks that I just imported and placed in here because I know that they will fit in the track. If you watch my streams, then you'll know this sound because it's the sound from one of the tracks that we've been working on a lot on stream. But it's just a fairly common kind of pluck sound from Serum here. As you can see, a bunch of different effects. It's just a filter on top of a wave, and then it goes through these effects to kind of make it sound better again, as I've explained many times before. The cool thing and the interesting thing about this sound is first of all Black Hole. This is a nice, very big kind of reverb plugin, and you can see that I'm using gravity at 91, which is almost as high as it will go. The other cool thing is that the delay on this sound is set to 70% wet, so you actually get a bigger delay than the sound is itself, and that means that kind of the delay is going to stack on top of all of the notes that are played, and obviously all of the copies are going to form these almost chord-like structures. And you get some really cool sounds from doing that. The next sound is this atmosphere that they created. This is also coming from a different track. You can see we just have a saw wave with randomized phases, as we did see before. We have very high detune and very many voices. This then goes through a filter and a hyper dimension, which again has a lot of detune here. The kind of sound that we're getting from here is that very big, very wide, very detuned kind of sound, but it's all very, very controlled. It's not so detuned to the point where it sounds like a whole chord or a bunch of different notes. It's all within the same note, but very detuned. So you get a very reverby kind of sound. We then have a pitch bend on it, which just goes down over time. You can see it happening here. Finally, we have a black hole for even more atmosphere and reverb to it. So this is what that sounds like. So without the reverb, it sounds like this. And then with the reverb, it just adds another dimension to it. Finally, we have an EQ just to restrict the frequency range to this very small range here. So that's how you get those kind of cool atmospheres. The next sound that I have is this one here. I actually don't know where this wave is coming from. You can see we have a whole bunch of different tones in here. I might have imported probably a sample that I imported and that somehow ended up looking like this. But this is a standard bandpass pluck kind of sound. And you can see we're randomizing both the actual wavetable that is used, the wavetable position, as well as the frequency of the band here. We then have hyper, chorus and reverb. It goes through a delay, and then it goes through this very cool reverb that I don't really use a lot because it most of the times doesn't actually sound good, but sometimes you can get this very tuned kind of reverb out of it, which sounds really nice. So if I set it to 100% wet, you can hear what it actually sounds like. And that just adds a little bit of tone back into the sound. Next up we have a very strong squelch. You can see that I'm playing with the MIDI in 2 different octaves. And the way that I do my very strong, very sharp squelches like these is that I use an envelope for the pitch and then I just automate the filter cutoff. You can see I do a bunch of different processing, but there's really not much more to it. There's no effects on here, so this is a very, very simple sound. You just get those very sharp, very high kind of pitchy sounds, which sometimes just add a little bit of extra high end to the track. This sound uses another cool sound design technique. We start off with a phase plant patch here, as you can see. You can ignore this because it doesn't really do anything. So this is the actual thing that we need to focus on, and you can see we just have an FM setup where we have one wave FMing another wave just to make this very small kind of part here. And this is then FMing a sine wave so that we get a little bit of an extra click in this part here. We then distort it and filter it, and then it goes through this freeform phase. Now I've shown before that freeform phase is a really cool way to add a little bit of extra texture to the sound like this. I just set up kind of a random phase distribution here, and what I'd like to do then is just to turn up the depth over a certain amount of time. Without it sounds like this. So this just adds a little bit of that extra kind of phasing texture to the sound. Again, standard processing for the rest of the chain, and then we go into the next sound. This is a cool sound here. I'm doing something with the note length. This is not something that I often do, but I like to automate the note length in some portions just to make sure that some parts it's a little bit more open sounding and some parts it sounds a little bit closer. When it comes to the sound design, again, it's very basic. We create a tone here. We use randomness to control the filter position, and then we have a bunch of different effects on here. In this case, I used a delay with high feedback and very low delay time, and I'm also randomizing this delay amount here. And then in order to make sure that that doesn't ring out further than the sound itself, we use an envelope to just shut off the mix whenever the sound is not playing. Standard processing again, so we can go on to the next sound. Here we have a big saw stab. You can hear what kind of a big kind of sound that we get from that. But you can see again the patch is very, very simple. We have 3 different oscillators all generating kind of not super saws because they're not using a lot of different voices. In fact, this sub is just creating one of them. But we create these detuned saw waves and then we filter out the high end from them. Add some distortion back in. Again, I like to use the asymmetrical distortions on a lot of my sounds because it's the only type of distortion which adds both even and odd harmonics. Especially if you want a very warm kind of sound, like in this case, that's something that you really, really want. So again, the rest of the effects just add to the sound. We have an EQ to cut out the lower frequencies and the higher frequencies. We saturate it quite a lot, as you can see, to really bring out the sound. And then we have a delay to make sure that it has a nice long tail. Here we have a very old sound. I made this sound now over 2 years ago, I think. This is one of the sounds that they use for a kind of remake of Deep Jungle Walk by Asterix. You may have seen parts of that project. I've been experimenting with that project a long time ago. Unfortunately, I did never finish that project, and I don't plan on actually finishing it because what I wanted to establish with that project is I wanted to see how Asterix kind of filled up all of his elements and filled up his track with elements, and that was something that I could gain out of it, not even with finishing it. So I was able to learn what I wanted to learn from that track, therefore I had no need to finish it. But I do have the sound still left and I do still have the project left, so I was able to take out this sound here. So as you can imagine, this was over 2 years ago, so I don't really know what is going on here. You can see there's some pluckiness going on with this envelope here, and it's also controlling some other effects. But to be quite honest, I don't really know what I was trying to do with this sound here. Now here we have my favorite sound of the whole track. We can see that we're setting up a tone again here. We're using this phaser here. This is a relatively new feature from Vital. As you can see, you can draw in your own phaser shapes, and I use that to create this kind of cool waveform here. This phaser is controlled by the first macro, which is also controlling our second filter here, which is the bandpass filter. And then we have a separate macro for this phaser here. So there's a lot of phasing going on in this sound, and then it goes through this very strong bandpass filter. Again, very simple effects. We have a delay on top of that. And then we have a glue compressor here just to make sure that everything stays intact. There's no sudden spikes in loudness. Finally, black hole is here for the reverb. And then we're controlling manually the actual macros in here, because that gives us a little bit more control and it makes sure that the sound always plays the same. So you can be very, very precise with the tone that you want to get from the sound. The next sound that we have is this other big saw kind of sound. This one, instead of being an impact like the one that we saw before, this one kind of sweeps up. So you get something like that. Again, basic serum patch, the idea is the same. We have some macro setup for all of the automations in here, which are 3. We have effects on there to shape the tone and get the loudness that we want. And finally, again, a delay, a glue compressor, and a black hole for the delay and the reverb. Next sound is this one, which is also squelch sound, but this one has a little bit of a different texture. This is actually a preset that I like to use sometimes. It's a Future Phonics preset that whenever I need a very simple squelch and I need it immediately and I don't want to spend the time to make it, I can just use this one and play with the filtering in here. So the filtering is what's actually responsible for the tone, and then I can just manually set where I want the filter to be. Next up, we have some digital sine plucks here. So this all is also from the Deep Jungle Walk remake, and this is just a sine wave where I'm modulating the panning. We're also velocity controlling the level here. So there's no effects on this. There's just a reverb that adds the reverb sound to it, and then it's just a matter of playing the right notes. As you can see from the actual MIDI that we're using. Maybe I can make this higher. You can see that by playing different notes you get different sounds, and I'm using this kind of everywhere in the track to just add a layer of that kind of nice digital feeling to the track. Here's another sound again from the Deep Jungle Walk remake. So this is kind of a little bit of a plucky sound. You can see we have a very fast pluck into it, and that's just creating this kind of plucky feeling. We have this LFO here, which is responsible for the panning action. And then we have a final LFO which just does a little bit of a volume shape. We actually have this downsampling distortion which isn't really doing anything. The mix is down, the drive is down, so it doesn't really do anything. And then we have just the hyper, as you can see. It's just set to the dimension part. The hyper itself again is not really doing anything. So again, very simple sound again. But that goes through some EQs. We have the old Redux. As you can see, this is the old version of the Redux. So you know that this is very, very old. This is set to 3. So that just adds a little bit of downsampling to the sound. We have another EQ to keep that downsampling in check. We then do some limiting, some echo, and then we have a sidechain in here. This next sound is actually from the track that I talked about before from the live stream. So this is a sound that I also imported from that track. In this case I'm using MR.Synth, which is a synthesizer that I don't really use too often because being a Melda plugin it is very, very complicated and I would need to dive into it for a month to actually understand what the synth is trying to do. But I just got a preset in here and I took a little bit of processing and I kind of made it big. I gave it that very nice, very big kind of delay that you can hear, and then what I'm doing is I'm actually controlling the delay itself. You can see the dry wets that I'm using and the automations that I'm using on the feedback as well. That is what is actually controlling the delay sound. And then we're creating just a chord, as you can see from the MIDI here. There's 3 notes being played, so that's what gives it the kind of chord feeling that we hear. It is sitting in the group in this project because it's in the other project it is paired with another sound. That other sound didn't fit the track, so I took that one out and I just kept it in the group. There's some more effects on the group itself. As you can see, another delay, there's another reverb, some EQing. The next sound is this one. There's a nice aggressive kind of noisy lead that I wanted to add as well. So you can see again the whole trick is we generate a tone with the oscillators. It goes through a filter for movement. This is randomly selected in this case. And then we have a bunch of different effects for the actual effect sound here. In this case we're using a delay which is just set to a very short timing and a very short feedback. So that kind of acts as like a doubler. And this is controlled by the macro as well as a bunch of other different parameters like the resonance of this filter. You can see we're slightly modifying wavetable position of this first wave here. and then we're using the macro as well on the drive itself. Then goes through a chorus as well as delay outside, which is just doing normal delay things. So that means that we're at the final lead sound here. Here we have just a standard bandpass pluck. So this is saw wave going through a bandpass. This is all randomized. And then we have a phaser where we're also randomizing the depth and the frequency. We then have hyper and downsampling distortion. It then goes through TR5 Suite, which is a collection of a whole bunch of different TR5 plugins. I bought this kind of on a whim, and in this case I'm just using it for a high pass filter and a bit of compression. This is an 1176 remake, so this does very strong compression. Honestly, this is a plugin that I'm not using too much. It was on a very large sale, so that's why I bought it. It was kind of like an impulse buy. But I'm not really satisfied with the plugin in the way that it works. It does sound very, very nice, and overall it's a great plugin for what it's doing, but there are some grievances that I have with the plugin that I won't go into now. So that's why you don't see it more often in my projects. Finally, on this sound we have a delay for the classical kind of delay that you want on this sound, otherwise it just sounds too boring. And finally we have a convolver for the reverb. So those are all of the lead sounds from the project. I now want to quickly talk about all of the atmospheres and whatever I have in the pads group. As you can see, it's almost all audio, so I cannot actually show you the sound design that went behind it. What I can do is explain you the process by which I create these sounds. And that mainly comes from going into synths, finding pad sounds and then resampling them. And that allows me to either see them as a waveform to see exactly where I want to place them on the track, where I want, for example, the reverb tail to end or something like that. Or it allows me to add fade-ins, which I may have done for some of these sounds. You can see this one has a big fade-in. So this was originally just a pad that was playing everywhere and I added a fade-in to it. This is actually the second fade-in that I've been adding. As you can see, if I remove this fade, you can still see that it has a fade left. But that does not come from the patch because I like to use normal kind of pad sounds which just play kind of like a stable note, and then I just take that and turn that into an atmosphere. So you get something like this. In this case it has a bit of a choir feeling to it as well. And really all of these atmospheres kind of are created in the same way. There's some that are still in MIDI, so here you can see an Omnisphere patch that I'm actually using. When it comes to Omnisphere itself, I just like to browse the presets itself because the preset library is so immensely big that you will never get the same sound again, which means that it's just an endless preset browser for me, and I just use the different functionalities that this has to browse the presets. For example, I like to use the shuffle mode, which shuffles all of the presets, or I can use sound match, which will take a preset and suggest presets that sound very similar to it or that use very similar sound designing techniques. So once I've found the preset that I like the sound of and I have this one preset, I can just duplicate it, record it, take a bunch of different presets with that sound match that all sound very similar, and that's how I create all of the different atmospheres for the track. Finally, for the rest of the track, we have a bunch of different effects here, which is not really that interesting, and we have some vocals. The final thing that I want to show you is what I'm doing with these vocals. Here I have a bunch of different vocal sounds coming again out of Omnisphere. And then we're combining them together and we're using M Transformer to actually do some really cool processing with the pitch. So that in some spaces the pitch is actually higher than in other spaces. So this just makes it so that it's an octave higher and you can hear the difference. You can hear that it's sounding an octave higher in this part of the track than it is in this part. And again, you can see the kind of automations that I'm using for this particular sound to just keep it moving, to keep it different and to keep it changing. There's a bunch of different ideas in here. For example, there's this one, which is a transgate made in LFO tool. I'm just using the depth to add movement to different parts of the pad sound of what this vocals actually is. It's kind of like a background pad, but also a main vocal because it is coming through the mix a lot. So that's why I want to do a lot of that kind of movement to keep it interesting, to keep it new. And that's also why instead of just using one main sound, I use a main sound and then I layer different sounds on top of it. When it comes to the mixing of the track, there's not really much interesting things to show you. It's just a matter of balancing everything through volumes. What I do want to show you is my mastering process. So the way that I like to master is I first run it through this Shadow Hill Industries mastering compressor. And the way that you want to use this is you want to have both the optical and the discrete take away 1 to 2 dB of gain reduction. And you can see for the discrete stage we have a ratio of 1.2, we have an attack which is fairly short, and we have a recover or release which is also very short. These are the settings that are recommended within the manual of the plugin. So if you have this plugin and you want to know how to use it, there's an actual manual inside which not only tells you all of the knobs that you need to set, but also how you need to set them, which is not something that I often see in a manual, but in this case it is in there. So if you want to see how I master with this compressor in particular, it's in the manual of this compressor. Next up, we have a little bit of an EQ to add a little bit of high end. This is just to bring out all of the higher frequencies a little bit more, as you can see. Actually, it's quite a lot. As you can see, it's plus 3.5 dB, which for mastering purposes is quite significant. And then finally, we have boost, which is my mastering limiter. And this is just set up in a way that I like. This is a very transparent limiter and it makes things sound very nice and very loud. So that's why I use this one. So that's the whole track. That's everything that I wanted to talk about. I hope that you found this interesting. I hope that it wasn't too drawn out, but it was also detailed enough. I wanted to go through all of the sounds and actually show you how it was kind of created. All of the sound design behind each of the individual sounds, but there's a lot of repetition in it. That came really from the way that this track came together. As I said in the previous video, it started off as a normal sidetrance track for me, where I have a bunch of main elements and then I go and make my one-shots that kind of fit around the elements and then I mix them all together. But for this particular challenge, the main elements just didn't seem to fit in. They didn't want to be in the track. So I ended up with a bunch of main elements that I couldn't use, and I decided to cancel out the main elements, add some more one-shots in. That's when I started importing some of the other sounds from the other tracks as well. And together with even more one-shots that I created specifically for the purpose, I decided to fill out the whole drop with mainly just one-shots. And that altogether resulted in the very complex kind of feeling that we got from this drop. It's not something that I often like to do. It's personally not a kind of technique that I like to work with. I really like to have a strong main element for my tracks. But it was an interesting experience nonetheless, trying to work all of them in and trying to fit them all into their own separate space without drowning out the rest of the sounds. I'm actually thinking about taking the concept of this track and some of the main ideas of this track, especially the kind of main leads group of this track, and turning that into an actual full track. But that's something that I would need to do much more longer in the future. I do already have a track where I'm using the main vocals and some of the atmospheres from the production here. Those were also imported from the other track to make them fit into this challenge. But that track has a completely different idea in terms of the main elements that sit in there. That is a track where there are a lot of main elements. So I hope that you enjoyed that. I hope that this was insightful. I hope this was a nice breakdown. Let me know by leaving a like down below if you did find this helpful. If you did not find this helpful, if you want anything to say to me or improve on my videos, then you can leave a comment down below. And if you're new here and you do find my content interesting, then make sure that you're subscribed. But with that being said, I hope you enjoyed the video and I hope to see you in the next one. Bye bye.